Hello there everybody, welcome back to the channel. We're continuing with my horror ranking series that I'm doing here in the week leading up to Halloween, and we're going with Friday the 13th. Today I'll be ranking every Friday the 13th movie from worst to best. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let's just get into the ranking. In last place is going to be the 9th Friday the 13th movie, Jason Goes to Hell. This movie is just awful. This is one of the worst Friday the 13th movies, not just because it's ridiculous and stupid, but because it barely features Jason. Instead, we get this body swapping plot that was just not it for this franchise. Friday the 13th has never been a staple of thoughtful horror. It is about Jason Voorhees killing people, except for the first one. And then you get a movie like this, which has basically no Jason Voorhees in it. The mythology gets convoluted, the tone is inconsistent, it is not scary really in the slightest. And in a movie called Jason Goes to Hell, I expected a little bit more hell in it. I expected to actually see Jason doing stuff in hell, and you don't get that at all. Really, this is the one Friday the 13th movie that to me I don't really ever want to watch again. It has no fun whatsoever. There's nothing to me here that's even campy good, so it's by far my last place. In 11th is going to be Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. If you're new to the franchise and you're seeing this title for the first time, you're probably thinking what I was thinking, which is, how can you go wrong with Jason taking Manhattan? Well, the way you go wrong is you spend the first 2/3 of the movie on a boat trying to get to Manhattan instead of just driving there or just starting there. And while that has most of the traditional slasher tropes in it, we didn't really need that. I mean, if you're gonna take Jason to Manhattan, maybe we should do some more iconic Manhattan stuff. And when we get to Manhattan, it actually is fairly campy good in the more traditional Friday the 13th sense. There's a lot of fun, ridiculous sequences in Manhattan that almost make this a little worth it, but the first 2/3 are excruciatingly boring. They're so traditional and cliche for this franchise. At this point, we're in the 8th movie. Do we really need to do a confined slasher again? And Jason on a boat, just not nearly as exciting as Jason in the woods. There are still some fun, ridiculous moments to be had, like when Jason punches a guy's head off. But other than that, this is also one of the longest Friday the 13th movies, and it shows its pacing is really bad. So this is one that I can rewatch for the last 30 minutes or so, but everything up to that is so excruciatingly painful. Coming in at number 10 is going to be Jason X, or Jason 10, if you want to go with that. This is the 10th Friday the 13th movie, really because it's, again, another concept that's interesting for the franchise, but it doesn't really make the most of it. This movie wants to both be an early 2000s, late 90s Matrix-inspired sci-fi, but also wants to be a Friday the 13th movie, and yes, that even includes in tone and in characters. This is a ridiculous group of people running a spaceship. When Jason does get unleashed on the ship, there are some good moments, some pretty gruesome moments as well. It's hard to say you want a Friday the 13th movie to take itself seriously, but I think Jason X needed to take itself a bit more seriously in its first half. So right off the bat, the characters are ridiculous and annoying and absurd, and you kind of want Jason to be defrosted and come out and get these guys because they're just so bad. And because this is ridiculous and still relatively unique, even though it doesn't make the most of its setting, I can watch this one more than I can watch especially the first 2/3 of Jason Takes Manhattan and all of Jason Goes to Hell. In 9th place is going to be Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. This, once again, is a movie that has no Jason, but at least Jason is there kind of in spirit. There is a killer dressed up as Jason trying to kill people. There's still some fun to be had in the more traditional Friday the 13th setting. The character of Tommy Jarvis, which is our main protagonist for 3 of the Friday the 13th movies, does get some expansion here, and I did appreciate the franchise's attempt at giving us a little mini trilogy around one singular character as this thing went on. You just also can't really escape the fact that this movie feels completely like a cash grab. There's nothing here in terms of story, and the character writing is obviously not deep enough to give us something that really feels like it's examining the subjects it wants to explore. But knowing Jason comes back in the sixth one, this one just feels even more like a cash grab. This feels like something that they just needed to put out because they were putting one out every year. It's a shallow movie, and ultimately, it can't escape the fact that it's a shallow movie. And because there's no Jason, it loses a bit of its stakes. In 8th place is going to be Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. The New Blood is alright. I enjoy this movie, I think, a bit more than some other people. Still by no means a good movie, but there is the added Tina character in this movie that adds a telekinetic element to this franchise. Yeah, we're getting really ridiculous. This is the one where they really tried to take a step in a new direction, where they tried to decide, do we want to push Jason kind of out of this franchise? Is this franchise going to survive much past this point? I mean, at this point, we had 7 movies in 8 years. Because it is a more traditional camp setting, yet doesn't feel completely new, and it also, the telekinetic powers do feel a little bit out of place. But unlike Jason X, where it doesn't really make the most of its new ideas, you do see a lot of telekinesis in this, and you actually do kind of get some payoff for that with the character of Tina, who's actually a semi-decent character as lead protagonists in this franchise go. Jason is also played by Kane Hodder here, who does one of the best versions of Jason throughout the series, even if he is in some of the weaker movies. And the look under the mask at Jason in this is actually really impressive from a makeup standpoint. It also is nice to just have some consequence for all of Jason's battles throughout this franchise. He is really deformed and decaying, and it looks good. I think it's an interesting direction to keep taking him. It's just the more generic things about the plot and the surrounding characters around Tina and Jason that keeps it a little bit lower for me, because if they really went into it with the new concept, I think this one could have been one of the better, if not still really campy, but one of the better Friday the 13th sequels. We're almost halfway through the franchise now, and at this point, we're getting to the ones that I think are all relatively watchable. Now, most of the Friday the 13th movies you can't really classify as good or great movies, but these ones are all enjoyable for what they do. And we're gonna start with number 7 here is going to be Friday the 13th, 2009, the remake. There are some big defenders of this movie out there, and I know a lot of people really like it, and I actually did enjoy it for what it was. Camp in modern slashers needs to be done very artfully and skillfully to work really well. There's something about the 80s aesthetic that just fits the ridiculousness of slashers. Trying to make a Friday the 13th movie in the modern day, in the late 2000s, it doesn't necessarily work in style to me. There are a lot of ridiculous one-liners in here that I think are perfect for this franchise, but there's something about the color palette and the design of this movie, the way it looks, the way it was shot, that just feels a little too modern. It takes me out of it a little bit, because Friday the 13th for me is so grounded in that 80s camp style. There's also really no likable characters in this movie. I don't really think any of them are worthwhile, and while the franchise isn't known for its likable characters, this one just doesn't have anybody I cared if they really lived or died. They're mostly parodies of what late 2000s teenagers would have been. I am impressed with the way they did Jason here. He is physically imposing. He is fast. I know a lot of people don't love that he's so fast in this movie, but I think it's a different take. If you're doing a remake, might as well try something new, and he is possibly scarier than he's ever been. And the opening scene is really good. It's classic Friday the 13th stuff. Admittedly, this is the Friday the 13th movie that I've seen the least. If I watch it a few more times, maybe it will rise in my rankings, but overall, I think about halfway through the list is the perfect place for this. This is by no means a bad movie, but I don't think it's great either. So coming in 6th place, exactly halfway through the list, is going to be Friday the 13th Part 3. Now, the 3D elements, if you watch this today without 3D, are absolutely ridiculous. You have so many shots that are so blatantly made for 3D. just the gimmick of 3D, not even good 3D shots, but they're made for the gimmick of 3D, like you're watching Muppet Vision at Disneyland. This is the first movie where Jason has his hockey mask, so it makes it iconic. And for me, when you're tracing horror franchises and horror tropes, especially in a franchise like this, where all the movies, especially in the top half of this list, are kind of at the same quality. Little things like that, iconic things like that, to separate them throughout the rankings. While this is also, once again, a very generic slasher, it doesn't feel as repetitive now that we're only at the third movie in the franchise. And while I don't know if I could say I like Jason more in this movie than I do in part 2, he certainly becomes the Jason we all know and love, and I really appreciate that about Friday the 13th Part 3. Coming in at number 5 for me is going to be Freddy vs. Jason. Now, Freddy vs. Jason delivers on the thing it promises. There are great Freddy and Jason fights in this movie, and really good sequences that utilize both of their iconic power sets. Once again, I'm not a huge fan of the way early 2000s and mid 2000s horror slashers presented themselves, and the color palettes, and in so many blues. Everything is just so dark and blue in these movies. With that being said, this movie still does embrace a lot of the things that make Jason and Freddy iconic. There are really good scenes for both characters. This movie, out of all of them, really does a fantastic job of delivering on its premise, especially in these later Friday the 13th movies, when you had these premises that were larger than life and ultimately never lived up to what they could be. And as is mostly tradition for this franchise, the story is kind of ridiculous and the characters are flimsy at best, but who cares about them? At this point, we are wanting Freddy versus Jason. That is the premise. That's what they sold, and ultimately this works as that. It's also a short enough movie to where when you get the Freddy Jason sequences, that's all I really care about, and that is entertaining. And bad characters and all, this is one of my favorites to rewatch in the franchise. And coming in at number 4 is going to be Friday the 13th Part 2. This is the one where we first get Jason Voorhees in full slasher glory. After watching the first Friday the 13th, I can't help but think that this movie is a bit too similar. I don't mind slashers going for repetitive, similar stories. They mostly all do that. And like I've been saying throughout this list, as you get later into the franchise, most of them get even more ridiculous, and sometimes keeping it simple is the best option. But there is a lot of this movie where I feel like it doesn't necessarily have its own full identity. What makes it iconic is Jason, and Jason, even with the bag head, is really great in this movie. He's brutal, he's gruesome, and it's even more brutal and gruesome than the first movie. When you have a horror sequel, a lot of times they just want to get gorier for gorier's sake, but we have this ominous villain that is teased the whole first movie in Jason, and he lives up to being a much more sinister force than Mrs. Voorhees. Once again, the characters are all mediocre at best, although Ginny is one of the better final girls in this series, but this is still a stripped down, low budget slasher, and there's a charm about that, especially this early in the franchise. And in many ways, Friday the 13th Part 2 is a classic. It's not necessarily a classic in its characters or story, but it's a classic in terms of how iconic it is, what it did for the early 80s slasher genre, how it continued to propel this genre into being the top horror genre for about a decade. We're getting to the third entry on the list, and it's going to be Friday the 13th Part 1. There is a big debate out there amongst fans. Is Part 2 better than Part 1, or is Part 1 better? And this is a close one for me. It does vary really on my rewatch. Sometimes I prefer 2, sometimes I prefer 1. I'm kind of a film historian. I love seeing how things evolve and change, not just through franchises, but through film history. I love seeing the way different movies have influenced different movements in cinema. And Friday the 13th has undeniable impact on the world of horror, especially in the 80s. Halloween popularized the slasher genre, but Friday the 13th gave it a lot of its cliches, both for better or worse. This is a movie that to me is still more iconic than great. The hallmarks of the series are all created here, whether it's Camp Crystal Lake in that setting, The POV slasher kills are really impressive here. Tom Savini's makeup and blood effects are excellent here, and one of the reasons this movie works really well. The acting in it is a bit better than the rest of the franchise. You have Betsy Palmer in here who really carries her role as Mrs. Voorhees. It's a movie that had some guts. It tried to copy a lot of Halloween, but it doesn't necessarily do it in the same way. It plays on what your expectations are from the formula of Halloween, and it adds a twist that does work really well, especially if you somehow don't know what it is at this point. Coming in at number 2, and this is where these movies actually start to get pretty good, is Friday the 13th, Part 4, The Final Chapter. Now, of course, this was not the final chapter, as this is the 4th movie out of 12, but it did do a good job of giving some finality to the story at this point. Now, it is disappointing that that finality couldn't really even be enjoyed in real time in 84 and 85, because we got a new Friday the 13th movie immediately after in 85, even if that one didn't feature Jason. And we got another one in 86 that brought Jason back. But there is a strong, more emotional, more dark and sinister tone to this movie that does actually end the story that we knew at this point. And to me, that's actually kind of impressive for a horror franchise. It doesn't feel like a cheap ending. It actually feels like a warranted, strong ending for this franchise. But some of the best stuff about this franchise all is here. You have Corey Feldman introduced as Tommy Jarvis, who gives the best performance as Tommy throughout his 3-movie trilogy. You have one of the most ridiculous and quirky casts of characters in this movie, and it actually fits the fun of this franchise quite well, especially when you have somebody who ends up becoming relatively notable like Crispin Glover in this movie, who gives one of the weirdest, strangest, but also best performances in this entire series. But there's an intensity about this movie. The characters are a little bit better, which makes the excitement and the action and the thrills a lot higher in this movie. It is one of those movies that you actually do care what happens to the characters. You're rooting for them in the end. And so when Jason does meet his comeuppance, it's actually a pretty effective sequence. It's a pretty effective ending to this movie, and you don't say that too often about Friday the 13th movies. There are also excellent practical effects and some of the most iconic kills in the franchise, so this movie just really has it all. Gotta give it major props. It is certainly, to me, easily the second best movie in this franchise. And the funny thing is, I say one of the things that kills a little bit of the vibe of the ending of Friday the 13th Part 4 is Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, existing 2 years later, but that is my number 1. That is my favorite. Jason Lives, to me, is the perfect Friday the 13th movie. It has some decent characters, it has a lot of camp, and a lot of funny sequences. There are some great, hilarious kills, and this is by far the best time I had watching a Friday the 13th movie. Jason's resurrection is perfect for this franchise. It's not contrived, it's not too complex. It literally is, he gets struck by lightning like Frankenstein and comes back to life, and to me, that is what this franchise needs when you resurrect Jason. Don't think about it, just roll with it. And I completely did. I thought it fit the character. Like most of my favorite slashers, this movie is self-aware. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It is tongue-in-cheek in a lot of ways. I think especially about the paintball kill, which is a hilarious sequence, but also this movie still holds its gore factor and its scare factor. It doesn't hold back on those in a lot of ways. I'm not comparing it to the quality of something like Scream, but it is a precursor to that style. It's something that is intentionally funny, has actually clever, campy writing, but also delivers when it's time to be afraid. Tommy Jarvis is here again for his 3rd movie in the trilogy, and he works really well here. He's much better than he is in the 5th movie. I appreciated that the series did give us a character to actually latch on to and grow with for 3 movies in this franchise. And this movie has an electric pace. It's so fun, it's so entertaining. This is the one, to me, that every time the franchise starts feeling stale when I rewatch it, this one relivens it up. Just like it resurrects Jason, it really resurrects the fun and the tone of this franchise. And yeah, it might not be as dark or sinister as it was in the 1st movie or the 2nd movie, but to me, this is the perfect embodiment of the mix of camp and horror. It's the movie that rides that line the best out of everything. And for a franchise that becomes so ridiculous, this is a movie that has a lot of fun, with those tropes, and I really appreciate that about this movie. So those are my Friday the 13th rankings. What do you guys think? What are your favorite Friday the 13th movies? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to see your guys' rankings. Stay tuned for more horror videos like this coming throughout this week. Thank you so much for watching this video. Check out my Chucky rankings, which are already up on the channel if you haven't, and I will see you all next time.